all your science and tech news, it's Staś Butler with The Download.
Welcome to The Download from Radio Taiwan International, where we cover all the latest developments in science and technology. I'm your host, Staś Butler, and I'll be taking you through everything you need to know. Today, I speak to Dr. Alex Teachey from Academia Sinica. He tells me why he came to work in Taiwan and how his field of astronomy is answering fundamental questions about life on planet Earth. All that coming up on The Download.
So my name is Alex Teachey. I'm a postdoctoral fellow at Academia Sinica Institute for Astronomy and Astrophysics. And so I'm an astronomer. And what I do is I work on finding these things called exomoons. These are moons of exoplanets. Exoplanets being planets orbiting stars outside of our solar system. So at this point we have discovered several thousand of these exoplanets. And just like the planets in our solar system, most of them have moons, in some cases quite a few moons, Jupiter and Saturn, Uranus and Neptune. And so it stands to reason that these planets orbiting other stars, they may also have moons as well. And so that's what I do. I look for those moons, and they're spectacularly difficult to find, but I think they're quite interesting targets, and so that's what I work on. Why did I come to Taiwan? I finished my PhD at Columbia University just last year, 2020, and then when you finish a PhD in astronomy anyway, you'll be looking for postdocs typically. You don't usually go directly to a faculty job necessarily. People will get a research position for several years. And so you apply all over the place. I applied, 20 some jobs or something all over the world. But this one in Taiwan I was particularly keen on. I had a lot of Taiwanese friends actually, and the more I learned about Taiwan, it seemed like a place that I could really dig living. And so I applied for this job, and I was thrilled to get it. And so they brought me over here in February 2020 to kind of like entice me to take the job. And I was just sold immediately. I mean, I felt a little embarrassed that that they had flown me over here to try to like convince me. And I was like, yeah, I'm convinced. Like,
you didn't need to try.
Yeah. I was like, thanks for the trip, but it was, all the same, it was very nice to be able to see Taipei and kind of know what I was getting into. I wasn't taking a job totally sight unseen. So they flew me over here right before the pandemic started in earnest, hit the United States in March, and everything locked down. And then I knew that I had this job lined up, so I was just sort of counting the months that I could get over here. And I finally got over here in September of 2020. So I've been here about a year now. So,
I mean, it's interesting. So you were already drawn to Taiwan before you came. What kind of awareness did you have of it? I mean, as a place to live and as a kind of research environment?
Yeah, it's I lived in New York City, so it's a very diverse city, of course, and I had a lot of East Asian friends, really from all over the place, but especially Chinese American, and but I, like I say, also had a lot of Taiwanese and Taiwanese American friends. I think I just sort of always felt like maybe I would be quite comfortable living in East Asia. I'd never really been over here at all until 2018, I guess. It was just a quick visit to Thailand and Japan. And I just kind of got a sense that, this is kind of a place that I could dig more broadly, East Asia, I mean. And then Taiwan in particular, the more I learned about it, it's sort of a fascinating history, and it's really got everything that I really want in a place to live. I like living in a city, so Taipei is great like that. I mean, living in Taipei is in many ways very similar to living in New York City, if not better, in my view. I hate cold weather. I lived in New York City for 17 years, but it's just frigid, and I just, I hate it. I'd much rather be dripping sweat, which of course I have been in the Taiwanese summer, but that's preferable to to freezing. The mountains are beautiful. The flora and fauna. You're close to the mountains. You're close to the beach. The food is fantastic. The people are just lovely. Everything's just it's really great here. And as far as the research opportunities, my particular field is so small, exomoons. I mean, there's so few of us working in it that, in contrast to other astronomers, where they will say, okay, well, I work on this, and therefore I need to go to that institution because that's also where they focus on this sort of thing. There's so few of us doing this particular kind of work that I felt like, well, I can't really shop around for people that will be collaborators. I'm going to be kind of on my own wherever I'm going to be, and I don't really require in the course of my work, a lot of telescope resources, which is also important for other astronomers. Asia A, where I work, certainly has access to premier telescopes, but it just the nature of my work doesn't really require it. I use mostly space telescopes. So I could basically work anywhere that would be willing to pay me. and I was just sort of, I felt very fortunate that Asia A took a chance to endorse this work and to give me a job for a few years.
So is it fair to say, I mean, it's always incredible, I guess, to any kind of lay person sort of listening to an astronomer. You're like, I don't really use a big I just use the big space telescopes, it's pretty, run-of-the-mill stuff. But you kind of characterize your field as kind of quite niche, even within kind of, astronomy, I guess.
That's right. Yeah, it's under the broader umbrella of exoplanets, and exoplanets as a subfield of astronomy has exploded in the last 20 or 30 years. So it's huge and it gets a lot of money. But within exoplanets, there's very few people that are doing this work, looking for the moons, because they are very challenging to find. And I think a lot of people have sort of said, well, we can't do it yet, but. In astronomy or any field, you're always going to be kind of pushing the envelope and seeing kind of what's next. And so I just kind of dropped into this. But it's kind of nice to be in a small field because you can kind of make a name. There's still sort of low hanging fruit. It's not that it's easy, but there's still sort of fundamental work to be done. And then you can make a little bit of a splash doing this kind of work, actually.
So you say there's been a kind of explosion particularly in the field of exoplanets and in that whole area. Why is that? What's behind that?
Well, it's just in the last few decades that we've had the technology really to do it, and so when we discovered the first planets the first one is in 1992, and then there was another major discovery in 1995. And then the Kepler Telescope was under development, and that was really kind of a game changer for detecting planets. There's a variety of different ways that we would do it to look for these planets, but the Kepler Telescope in particular stared at one patch of sky and just stared there for 4.5 years, monitoring the brightness of something like 200,000 stars. And we get these things called light curves, where you're monitoring the brightness of this star, and when a planet passes in front of the star from our point of view, you see this little dip. And, because the planet goes around again and again, this is a very sort of periodic dip, and therefore you can see these planets comparatively easily. I mean, it's not easy work, of course, but compared to some other ways that you might try to do it, it's really sort of a game changer, because now, like I say, we have thousands of these planets, and they've told us a great deal about. Of course, there's other systems, but also kind of where we fit in. I mean, our solar system. In what ways are we ordinary, and in what ways are we extraordinary? Until we discovered these exoplanets, we had a very sort of tidy picture about how stars form and how planets form. And then all of a sudden, we started seeing these things that are, quite bizarre based on that picture. And so we've had to kind of go through a rethink about all of these sort of processes. And then, like I say, where do we fit in? I think it's an open question that people are interested in, for one thing, about the origin for life. Obviously we see life here, but how common is life out there in the galaxy? We don't know the answer to that yet. But I think either answer to that, whether it's common or whether it's uncommon, both of those answers are equally intriguing and equally important.
I mean, you had quite an unusual route into academia, I think it's fair to say. I mean, how did that happen for you?
Yes, that's right. I studied as an actor before I went into science. So I went to New York University and got a whole degree in theater. And I did a little bit of acting work, of course, after I graduated, but not much. I needed to make money, and I made money by getting an office job, which wasn't terribly conducive for going out for those auditions. And I got very sort of comfortable sitting there and saying, well, I'm making this money and my job is easy, and I'll get back to the acting in about a year or two. But that became 2 years and 3 years and 4 years, and I started realizing that I just wasn't really feeling the burn to be out there hitting the pavement and going out there for those auditions. I love to act, but the business of being an actor is quite dreadful in some ways, and it's just not for me. But all the same, I was quite young, and so I was just sort of casting about what else I could do that really felt worthwhile to me. And eventually I had stumbled on, I was like, well, I really love science, physics, and astronomy especially. And I like teaching people about it. I like communicating these things. And, there's so many people in this world that say, oh, I can't really get it. I don't like math. I don't like physics. And, that's fine, to each their own. All the same, I do think that people are capable of doing these things. And it's more a question of whether or not you're interested in learning these things. Anybody can do the math. But if you don't want to do the math, if you're not interested in the math, then it's much more difficult to stuff it into your brain because you just have no incentive to do it. But it's possible, right? So I very much like the idea that you could talk to people in a way that would get them excited and make them see that these concepts are not tough necessarily, that just it's sort of different ways of coming at it. So I decided that I wanted to be a physics teacher, and I went back to school to get a second bachelor's degree, quite unusual, I suppose. Got a second bachelor's degree in physics at Uncer College, a part of the City University of New York. And in the course of doing that, I started doing astronomy research, and that's when I really got hooked on that stuff. And it was the first time that I really realized that you could go to get a PhD and get paid for it. I certainly didn't have any more money to go to school, but if they're going to pay me, it's a game changer. And I saw that as, well, okay, I'll get my doctorate in astronomy, and I'll spend 5 years doing this research, which I love. And at the end, even if I don't stay in the field, like what are the downsides? There were hardly any for me that I could see. It's a job for 5 years, doing what I love, getting paid, and coming out with this credential on the other end. So that's kind of how it all went down, and then I graduated last year from Columbia, like I said, at age 35, which is a little older than other, some of my cohort, but not terribly old. I think I still feel young at heart, anyway.
So, what drew you to? I mean, you talk about doing your undergraduate degree and then sort of falling in love with astronomy. What drew you to it in particular?
Astronomy is, what drew me to it was I got really hooked on Carl Sagan, actually. Carl Sagan was, I was always into astronomy as a kid, but a friend of mine introduced me to the Cosmos series, which he, came out in 1980 on PBS. And I just got hooked. There was something so elegant and grand about it, in his presentation anyway, that really sort of, changed my whole thing. It's not just that stuff is really cool, but it's really sort of this grand process, this whole journey, thousands of years in the making, of us, coming from not knowing anything about the outside world to finally discovering that, we're just this tiny little speck in this vast ocean of space, and that there is so much out there waiting to be known. And so, the details of it is certainly cool. I dig actual process of doing the research, writing the code and discovering these things, and actually to look at something that no one has ever seen. To get data from a telescope and it's totally fresh, and I'm the first one ever laying eyes on this data, is really an arresting kind of experience. I think it just, all of a sudden I couldn't really imagine anything more spectacular than sort of interfacing with this most enormous of subjects.
You talk about kind of seeing things for the first time. It suddenly strikes me that it's it's a shame that in astronomy you have such dry names for exomoons and planets. You feel like there could be a few exomoons out there with your name on them by now, maybe.
Yeah, they have sort of license plates, we'll call them. Yeah, they all have this because they get named. The planets get named after the telescopes by and large, right? So it's Kepler. In the case of the Exomoon candidate that I identified a few years back, Kepler 1625b. B is the planet, and then the satellite gets a Roman numeral 1 for the satellite. That's, of course, how the moons in our solar system were originally named when we started discovering these moons in the outer solar system. Jupiter 1, 2, 3, 4, etc. And they actually still have Roman numerals. It's really just a testament to how many things there are out there. All right, asteroids, they all have a number, and we've discovered a few 100,000 of those at this point. And actually, they do get names. Astronomers get asteroids named after them. Someone discovers a new asteroid, and they get to name it after their friend. But when it comes to these planets, there's literally trillions of planets in the Milky Way galaxy. And so if we had to come up with names for all of them, it would be quite tedious, I suppose. Or you'd have, I don't know, the Boba Fett planet and that kind of thing. People would just be coming up with all kinds of goofy stuff. So it doesn't really bother me that they just get numbers. But it does become kind of challenging sometimes because at least my old advisor, he would just kind of remember all of these planets, and they're just numbers, right? He's like, oh yeah, check out Kepler 90, it's in a really interesting system. And, it does get hard to kind of catalog it in your brain sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I imagine it, in some ways it'd be possibly easy to remember, but also you can imagine going back, I guess, to your original ambition of being a physics teacher. It's almost like kind of you're in a classroom of 1,000 kids, and you have to remember all of their names.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. Right.
All of your what you're studying. I mean, you actually bring this up to my next question, which was this research you did on Kepler 1625b.
Right.
Is that fair? Is it fair to say that's the kind of the biggest sort of event of your kind of academic career so far?
Oh, certainly for mine, yes. It's we got Hubble data, and so unlike Kepler is just up there. Not anymore, unfortunately. But for a time, it was taking data and it would send it back to Earth, and everybody just got to use it. Whereas with Hubble, you have to propose to use it. You have to write up a whole thing. This is what we want to do with it, and they will make your observation, and that observation belongs to you for 6 months. Eventually, it becomes public, so that anybody can work with the data. But initially, it's proprietary, and so that was enormously gratifying to be able to work with this several $billion instrument, and it's spending 40 hours staring at my target, and very nerve-wracking at the same time. Did we get everything right? And a lot of pressure, because the exomoons are, in particular, no one has really found a conclusive example of one yet. There have been these candidates, including 1625, and some people would say that 1625b remains sort of the most promising of the candidates out there. People would debate about that. Some people don't. Some people would think it is not there. I think it's maybe there, but I won't, I think the jury's still out on it. But there was a lot of people, a lot of attention on us, a lot of pressure on us to get it right. And we got the data, and we had journalists writing me the next morning being like, well, is it there? Did you see it? She said, hold on a second. And, we really spent a whole year diving into that data and trying to understand every little bit of it that we could. And it made a splash, even though it was a sort of a strange paper that we ended up writing, because typically either you say it's there or it's not there. And we wrote this paper saying, well, we've run all these tests and it kind of looks like it's there, but we're stopping a little short of saying it's definitely there. And people didn't really know what to make of that. They were like, well, it's almost like we're trying to have it both ways. We're trying to say we got the discovery, but that we're kind of covering our rear by not getting out too far ahead of it. But we're just trying to be honest about how we talked about it. So yeah, it was a big time. I'm happy to have it a little bit in the rear view mirror because it's just one system, and I've done all with it basically that I can. It's time to move on to other things.
So I mean that's something I didn't realize. That you're saying that there aren't any real kind of 100% identified. We've definitely got this exomoons currently on our records. Is that right?
That's right. Yeah, there have been sort of tantalizing hints that maybe we found something here, maybe we found something there. And because it would be potentially the first, we try to be exceptionally hard-nosed about it. Something that my former advisor, David Kipping, back at Columbia says is, when you have 4,000 planets in the catalog, someone comes along and they say, oh, we found one more. Well, nobody really bats an eye, and nobody even scrutinizes it very much. But if it is going to be the first one, then people are really going to probe it and question it and do their own independent analyses of that sort of thing. And that's part of the process, right? That's how it should be. I mean, I sort of regret that the 4,001st planet is not getting the same kind of scrutiny that the first or the 10th one is, because they should all be scrutinized, of course. And so it's challenging. The data is we're just on the edge of having data that's really enough for us. We're asking these telescopes to do things that they really were not designed to do. And these moons, you can imagine, are very, very small. Just to give some concreteness, when a planet passes in front of its star, it blocks out something like maybe a tenth of the starlight. And that's for something, as big as Jupiter, right? I mean, a very, very large planet. Will block out just, depends on a variety of factors. But we're talking about very, very little dips in the intensity of the starlight. And then a moon is much, much smaller. I mean, smaller than the Earth. And so you can imagine it's a smaller moon, so a smaller object blocks out a lot less light. And so we're talking about, we're talking about a few hundred parts per million is the size of this signal that we're looking for. And there's all sort of other confounding noise and other signals in the data that we have to sift through and clean in a sort of agnostic way. And so it becomes very challenging to do the work, and it's really not necessarily a surprise that we haven't found them, and maybe not such a surprise that there isn't a huge industry of people working on this yet. It'll come eventually, but we're trying to, somebody has to do the pathfinding, and I guess it's us.
And you talk about it sounds almost like you're hitting the kind of the limits of what's available with the kind of data at the moment. I mean, where do you think the next, what's going to be the next step that takes you that extra bit further? Is it going to be better hardware, things up in space with better technology, looking in the right places, or is it going to be stuff like, you talk about your own experiences learning to deal with machine learning and things like that? Where do you think those next advances are coming?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of all of the above. I mean, we definitely have these new telescopes coming online, and these are very long time scales. Sometimes we're talking 10 or 20 years down the line. Light collecting power is very important. The bigger your mirror, the more light you can collect instantaneously. And when we're looking at something like a light curve, telescopes operate in a way where if you just stare at something long enough, just like taking a long exposure photograph, if you stare at something long enough, you can collect more and more light. But once you start segmenting the data so that it's a time series, right, then you don't get to stare at it infinitely long, right? You only get as much light as you get in that instance, and you can kind of stack it up a little bit. But the more you stack it up, the less sort of time resolution you have, right? And so for something like doing time domain, time series observations, you just need a bigger telescope. At the same time, we can't put infinitely large things in space. I mean, we can build big telescopes here on the ground, and there are currently plans to build telescopes that are 30 meters across in some cases. So that's really astonishing. But then you have all kinds of challenges from working on the ground versus working in space. So hardware will be part of it. And then people just have to kind of get creative about ways of looking for things. And we're still kind of coming up with new ways that we might identify these moons, which is very exciting to kind of, be dreaming up some entirely new technique of looking for these things is quite challenging as well, as you might imagine, but it's also quite gratifying, because then those are the tools that other people will come along and use eventually to actually find those things. And the weird thing about coming up with new ideas is that if you come up with an idea today, you say, well, why didn't I think of that a year ago? I mean, well, you didn't have that year in the process to kind of slowly have that percolating in your brain. And so you kind of have to have a little faith in the community to eventually dream up things that haven't been thought of yet. And that's part of why I really hope in the future we can get more people working in this particular field, because we need more brains kind of thinking through these problems and coming up with ways of doing it.
And how has, looking, I guess, at machine learning in particular, how has that changed the field in recent years, or has it changed the field in recent years?
Yeah, so I've written a paper, it's hopefully going to come out soon, using machine learning to look for exomoon signals. We got very good results in our training data, but then we apply it to the actual data, and it doesn't give us much. And that's challenging to interpret, right? Okay, so we do 98% accuracy with this training set, but then we throw it on the real data, and it gives us 1% of this data looks like maybe there's moons there. So because we don't really know the answer ahead of time, are we just not doing very well with the real data, or is there really just not much in the way of moons sitting in the data? That's a sort of a hard question to disentangle. But more broadly, machine learning is exploding in astronomy, partly because the data volume is just becoming enormous, right? I mean, increasingly, we just have enormous amounts of data coming down on a daily basis from these telescopes all around the world. And how do you parse all of that? At a certain point, machine learning becomes the only way of doing it, right? I mean, we use machine learning in processing mail, and that's just because we can't have someone reading every single envelope and determining where it's supposed to go. The volume is just too enormous in order to be able to do that. And so in that respect, machine learning is going to be very powerful. But at the same time, it's not a silver bullet. I think a lot of people think, okay, here's my training data. I'll just throw it at the algorithm. The algorithm will learn all the things, and then I'll throw it at my problem, and everything will be solved. And it clearly doesn't work that way. And, we're basically trying to, it's called, like neural networks, for example. It's designed to kind of be like the brain. But the brain is incredibly sophisticated, and however much training you do of these algorithms, you can't really beat the brain. There's sometimes that machine learning is going to be more about scalability than it is about doing better than humans. And just more broadly, not just in astronomy, but machine learning is obviously taking over the world in all kinds of different aspects. But it clearly has limits, and it is limited by what we ask it to do, and it makes mistakes all the time. Right? It will do these things that you didn't really think it was going to do, like the Twitter algorithm that's trying to figure out what's the most important thing about the picture. And, turned out it was always focusing on the white people, and people were doing all these experiments. I don't know if you remember that, when people were uploading these pictures, and it was just always sort of zeroing in on these things. Now, no one at Twitter said, let's always focus on the white people, but the algorithm was just sort of having this weird side effect, and they said, okay, well, we need to kind of go back to the drawing board. And you can't even tell the algorithm, like, stop focusing on the white people all the time. You can't even code that. It's just something that it has sort of learned accidentally, and you need to kind of go back and figure out why it's doing these weird things. But machine learning in the short term will definitely keep doing weird things like that, and so we can't become too reliant on it.
So you see kind of machine learning in your field as doing maybe more of the kind of grunt work of kind of sifting through all this data than necessarily the kind of groundbreaking sort of big front page making kind of discoveries.
Yes, I mean, so, there is these things called unsupervised learning, for example, where people are trying to see if it can identify new phenomena. So humans have said, oh, well, this thing falls into 3 categories. But then if your algorithm says, well, guys, there's really 4 categories here. And if you felt really good about the performance of this thing, then you might say, maybe this is something different that we have overlooked. So it can still kind of make those important kind of discoveries. But by and large, our own sort of biases are going to be encoded in it. And as you say, it will do a job very well of identifying things that eventually, I think, at least in the short term, a real thinking human being is going to have to go look at it and make sense of what the machine is finding. And sometimes it's going to be legit, and sometimes it'll be trash. And you'll still have to have somebody there sort of sorting through it all.
Turning now to another bit of research you did, which was something perhaps a bit more kind of theoretical. This is this research you did looking into kind of the uses of lasers to hide the presence of an atmosphere, and whether that was theoretically possible, and what kind of energy you would need to do that. I mean, how tell me about that paper.
Well, you've done your research. That was a paper I did very early in my PhD studies with my former advisor. David Kipping is his name, and he is just got ideas coming out of his ears all the time. He's really astonishing. He's one of these people that I hope he can get some major discovery that really puts his name in the books long term, because his work is just, I don't know many other astronomers who have so many creative ideas just kind of constantly coming out of him. And he's also a beast. I mean, he can write a paper in a weekend sometimes. And that was exactly what happened in that case, is something like on a Friday, he's sort of thinking, well, we talked about these transits before, right? The planet is passing in front of the star, blocking out some of the starlight. And he said, well, would it be possible to kind of like fill that missing starlight in some way? And he started running the numbers, and he said, well, what would you need? Well, you could shoot a very powerful laser out right at that instant and, sort of make up that missing starlight. And he determined, through some, back of the envelope calculations, that this was very much possible with, really like almost present day technology. We don't have this thing built, but we could certainly build it. And that's the sort of thing where he's been interested in exomoons. He's really sort of a pioneer in the exomoons field, but he's also always been interested in the search for extraterrestrial intelligence and that kind of thing. And so, this is another whole subfield, thinking about ways that we might detect extraterrestrial intelligence. And so that was sort of a paper that he and I wrote in about a month, and I just kind of contributed some calculations for it. We asked about maybe you could just hide the signatures of life in your atmosphere rather than hiding the planet entirely. And it was just kind of an interesting thought experiment, but it got picked up in the press, and this was sort of my first instance of interfacing with a science journalism. That it's clearly a very sort of sensational idea, and it's almost like catnip for people. Then they will write this article and say, astronomers propose that we hide the Earth with this laser, and it's a little bit of a game of telephone, and then people, even astronomers. I mean, it can affect people's interpretation of what we do all day as astronomers. Oh, I can't believe we're funding this kind of work. And then it will even affect, maybe how other colleagues will see you. Oh, I saw you had this really sensationalist paper. I read the article. I didn't read the journal article. I read something on space.com or whatever about how you want to hide the Earth with lasers. And, so it can be kind of tricky for us as scientists to sort of navigate science journalism in these sorts of circumstances.
Maybe, I suppose, you talk about having kind of reflected on that experience and perhaps learned from it. I mean, how would you do things differently? And also, how do you think, on the other end, journalists should do things differently?
I don't know that we would do things much differently. I mean, I guess the best thing that we could do is just not answer journalists' questions about such a thing. I mean, the first time someone calls you, hey, I'd like to write an article about your work, you say, oh, awesome, great, and then you start getting more and more inquiries, and you start feeling like, well, maybe this is getting a little out of hand. I mean, we really don't need to be getting this much attention. And so what am I supposed to do? Like, say I'm not taking any more comments? I mean, that seems kind of strange, right? Like, well, why won't you talk to us?
Are you hiding something? Are you hiding your space lasers?
Right.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly right. Yeah. I mean, it was the same thing actually with this sort of Medigen experience where, the first time someone reaches out, I say, yeah, sure, fine, whatever. But the third or fourth, you're kind of like, maybe I should just not be, giving more fuel to this fire, because I think it's unnecessary. And then there have been other cases, of course, where my work, especially with Kepler 1625, again, has gotten interest from journalists. You worry about things getting sensationalized, and so to actually speak with the journalists is a way that we might sort of be a check against that, because I'm getting quoted directly, so I can say, let's not sensationalize this too much, or we're not claiming this, we're claiming this instead. I'd rather have my quotes in the article. So that at least I can somewhat be on record. When it comes to journalists, I don't presume to tell journalists how to do their job. It's a very difficult job, especially I think being a science journalist or even astronomy journalist. There's an enormity of stuff out there to know and to report on a daily basis, and there's no possible way that even someone who spends all their time writing on astronomy can understand all the ins and outs of this study or that study. And it's a rat race, right? I mean, you're looking almost on a daily basis. I'm sure you can speak to that, right? That you're constantly looking for, what can I write about today? and you don't even have time to fully ingest this stuff. And you're talking to people. There's been a lot of chatter, especially when we have sensationalist articles. There's all kinds of particularly sensational sort of headlines about this interstellar object called Oumuamua, and a lot of astronomers get particularly bent out of shape about the sort of the credulous coverage of these otherwise sort of outlandish claims in the views of a lot of astronomers. There's a lot of chatter, I guess, on Twitter between astronomers about how we handle all this sort of things. And astronomers need to guard against sensationalism and do our best. But we also don't get to proofread these articles, right? Astronomers be like, I kind of like to look over everything you're saying afterward. And journalists understandably push back against that. They say, that's not how we do it around here. I do my interview and then I write the article, and the article is what the article is. Unless it's, something totally egregiously wrong about it. You don't get to kind of choose the way it gets covered. So I have a lot of sympathy for science journalists covering this stuff. There's no way that you can possibly get everything accurate, but understandably, I think it sort of can frustrate astronomers because it's a little bit of a game of telephone, and by and large, your work becomes what the articles say your work is. Most people don't read your journal article. Most people read what they saw on Universe Today or Space.com or CNN or New York Post. I mean, something gets big enough, it gets covered all over the world, and you get to see in real time how kind of the claims get confused. And when it comes to someone reporting for CNN, they are sort of piggybacking off of the reporting of somebody else, and just down the line it goes. And so, there's pitfalls associated with this. I don't know what the solution is.
There's this story. I didn't check the precise kind of. I mean, I remember reading it, but I can't remember the wording. It was about the kind of about a potential sort of the story of the kind of Dyson Sphere around a kind of exoplanet. Is that the one? Is that the story you're referencing?
That's a different one, but that is another example of sort of things that got sensationalized, I would say.
I suppose the Dyson Sphere actually goes around a sun, doesn't it? Or it goes around a star. It was like
that's right. So you're probably thinking of this thing that has been called Boyajian star or Tabby's star, where we saw this very unusual and very deep dimming and erratic dimming of this star. So I mentioned before that when a planet passes in front, we see maybe 1% or a tenth of a percent of the light blocked out. But this was seeing 10, 20% of the light blocked out. And it's very sort of erratic signals. And so it was, suggested somewhere along the line that maybe we are seeing some sort of giant techno project, some sort of astro engineering thing. And this is the signature. I mean, this is the signature that people have said for years. Maybe we would see something like this. Astronomers tend to say, well, maybe, but there's probably a more ordinary explanation. And I think most astronomers in that case have said, yeah, it's probably dust. There's a lot of dust floating around this particular system, and it blocks out a lot of the light. It's not quite as sexy of an explanation, but that's probably what it is. What I was referring to is this interstellar object that came from another place outside of the solar system, called Oumuamua, and we could tell by how fast it was moving that it just clearly is not from the solar system. And it was doing something very peculiar in that it was moving when it left. It was moving slightly faster than you would expect for some dead rock just on some orbital or hyperbolic trajectory in this case. And so people were trying to understand, well, why is it moving differently than we expect it to? The natural explanation is that it is something kind of like a comet, so it's shooting out jets of gas as it sort of warmed up passing by the sun. It shoots out these jets, and that speeds it up, right? The problem was that they didn't see any signatures of this outgassing, they'd call it. And so it has certainly been a little bit of a puzzle. But one particular astronomer has really made a lot out of claiming that this is an a space probe, basically, that this is an alien ship, maybe a derelict spaceship, but it is a spaceship. And, there's nothing wrong with sort of speculating that that's, maybe it could be, and then you investigate it. I don't have any problem with investigating it. But there have been a lot of papers and even a book now written about, this is a spacecraft. And most astronomers say, no, that is not proved at all, and there still is probably an ordinary explanation. But this is a very exciting possibility, of course, and so journalists, at least for a while, have been giving this guy a lot of airtime, and so astronomers are understandably, I think, sort of bent out of shape about it, getting way too much oxygen based on the plausibility of that explanation.
Does that annoy you? I mean, I suppose, it's kind of like, I suppose as an astronomer, you might feel that, it's like, oh, we're doing all this hard kind of grunt work, and then, maybe someone at some point just sort of accidentally mentions the possibility of aliens, and then everyone just jumps on the story.
Yeah, I think it's a balancing act when it comes to talking about extraterrestrial intelligence or something like this. We shouldn't be ruling it out. I mean, just because it is sort of a wilder explanation doesn't mean it's not true. And so we have to kind of look at that carefully as one possible explanation. There's nothing wrong with looking at it. The problem, of course, is that when it gets sensationalized in the media, then people pick it up. Maybe they just saw the headline, or they heard from their friend who saw the headline, and they'll say, "Oh, I heard we discovered aliens." And no. And what it does ultimately is, in the short term, it erodes people's understanding of astronomy and these sorts of things. More broadly, it erodes trust in science, because someone will come out with a sensationalist claim, and then another thing kind of knocks it down. And so if the article gets written, we discovered this thing, and then next month the article says, it turns out we didn't discover this thing, and people say, those scientists, they don't know what they're doing, they're just making it up as it goes along. Or you take it as, for example, medical reporting, or reporting on like a food science, where you'll see someone say, red wine is good for you, and another study comes out and says red wine is bad for you, and another study comes out and says, actually it's good for you, or red meat, or on and on it goes. That's part of the process, right? Articles should be testing these sorts of questions, and if they get different answers, then it means that more research needs to be done to properly understand this sort of thing. But if the article comes out and says, turns out red meat is good, and then another article says, turns out red meat is bad, people will, again, just say, well, I don't know what to believe. They can't trust it anymore. And so, I think astronomers or scientists in general, we really value sort of our skeptical way of looking at the world, and we think everybody should be, super hard-nosed about things and saying, well, I really don't think that's proven or something like that. Maybe not everybody needs to be so skeptical as astronomers. It's our job to be skeptical, and everybody else can just kind of read the article and be like, oh, okay, that's interesting, whatever, and go about their day. So I guess we get a little too worked up about some of these things getting misconstrued sometimes. But ultimately, I do think it is a danger, it's a worry for us to see these things get sensationalized and people getting misled in the process.
You yourself, I suppose, you host these, or hosted kind of outreach events, is that right?
Right.
So, I mean, I saw, this event, Astronomy on Tap. Right. What's the idea behind that?
Astronomy on Tap is a fantastic organization. It started in New York City, but it has gone to several dozen cities around the world at this point. And the idea is that you bring astronomy, in this case, to where people are, right? The people are at the bar, so let's bring astronomy to them. And there have been subsequently, sort of other, biology on tap, and people have sort of taken this idea to bring other fields to the bar as well. And it's just a lot of fun. People come out one night, usually about once a month. These events happen all over the world, like I say. And, people are having beers and having a good time, and you have games and you have prizes, but typically we feature one or a few working scientists to actually talk about what they do or talk about something interesting. Again, not in this super dry way, but in a way that's going to be engaging. And I think the public outreach is very important, especially in astronomy, where we don't really have the same sort of economic. It doesn't pay off quite the way. You train somebody as an engineer, or somebody works on developing vaccines or a cure for some disease. That clearly has very obvious benefits. Whereas astronomy, you can almost think of it a little more like funding the arts, right? I mean, everybody loves the arts, but how do you justify it? It's sort of hard to make it concrete. And so astronomy is in some ways a little more like that. It's valuable to us. People really respond to it. They love it. And I think astronomy gets people excited about science of all sorts. I mean, we interface with geology and chemistry and biology and physics, of course. All of these sorts of different fields, meteorology, atmospheric science, climate science, it all kind of gets wrapped up in astronomy in some ways. And so you can get people that they start interested in astronomy, but then they go and be a climate scientist, or they go and be a geologist or something. But astronomy is what got them hooked. And of course we need those kinds of scientists. I don't think we need more astronomers. There's something like 10,000 astronomers in the world, I heard one time. I think that's enough. I don't think we need to be recruiting more astronomers. But it's a good number where we are right now. And just to bring science to the people is something that they deserve, frankly. It's public funding, more or less. We get funded by the governments and we get funded by the universities. And so people are paying into this. And so I think they deserve to have to know a little bit about what they're getting for that money.
Do you think it's is this a possible route for kind of rebuilding kind of perhaps some public trust that you feel might be kind of lost elsewhere?
Potentially, yeah. I mean, most of these things, astronomy on tap, for example, is just very small. We reach 20, 30, 50 people at a time or something like that. So I don't know if that has any sort of broad impacts beyond, talking to these people that are already kind of science enthusiasts. It's usually the people that show up. But yeah, I mean, we have to be able to communicate to these things. We have these nature shows, and all of this is sort of goes a little bit of the way of getting people to understand science. And I think the more you understand science, the more you trust science. Right? Science is not perfect; it's just a tool. And so when you understand that everything is imperfect and we're just sort of zeroing in on the truth, and that we're not just saying this is the truth and this is the truth for all time. Once people can better understand those uncertainties, then they can understand what it is, right? It's something like a vaccine, right? I felt uncomfortable. So someone said, well, what would you tell people about getting the Medigen vaccine? I said, well, I wouldn't encourage anybody to get the Medigen vaccine. People should make their own decisions about it, right? There's uncertainties, and so the lie would be to say that there is no uncertainty. But I think a lot of people walk away saying like, oh, the scientists said this and they were wrong, therefore science is wrong. And that's clearly not the takeaway. Just once you understand the uncertainties, you will interpret the whole body of knowledge in a slightly different way, and I think a better way.
I mean, moving back, I suppose now to I suppose what you're doing now. I mean, what are you working on now in Taiwan, and where do you think it's gonna take you?
So still working on exomoons and also some planet detection. I had a student working with me for the first time this summer, and he's a fabulous student. Absolutely couldn't have asked for a better student. His name is Teachey, and he's from India, and we've been working remotely, looking for new planet discoveries, things that again never, hopefully find something that no one has seen before. We're the first ones to discover it. That's super gratifying. But beyond that, I continue to work on exomoons, and particularly right now, I'm working on this, ways that we can identify exomoons through what's called microlensing. Microlensing is a super cool thing. Gravity bends space-time, and what that does is that it bends the trajectories of light. And so it turns out that you can see through this bending of light and through amplification of light, right? It's a lens. It's a microlens because it's a very small little thing. But through these, very low-mass objects, the size of a moon, you can actually see evidence for them by the amplification of light of the background stars behind them. And so that's a very exciting idea. I'm not the first to come up with it, but I'm working on kind of a new angle with that, and that's pretty exciting. Like I say, I love working on exomoons. I just feel enormously fortunate that Asia A is giving me the opportunity to work on this stuff. I pretty much get to call my own shots and see what determine what I think is worthwhile to work on, and they've put their faith in me, which is quite gratifying.
That sounds super interesting, and I look forward to hearing more about it. Dr. Alex Teachey, thank you for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
That was Dr. Alex Teachey telling me why he thinks the world doesn't need any more astronomers, and how microlensing could be the next way we learn about our universe's exomoons. And if you want to hear more from Dr. Teachey, make sure to check out his website at alexteachey.wordpress.com or follow him on Twitter via the Twitter handle @AlexTeachey. And while you're at it, you may as well follow me at Staś Butler, of course RTI at Radio Taiwan International _eng for English, and Taiwan Insider, which is our flagship Thursday video show. And that's all we have time for this week. Next week, I speak to Jarvish, the company behind a futuristic new motorcycle helmet that's taken Kickstarter by storm. That's next week with me, Staś Butler, on The Download.